Welcome to the Xceptional Insights podcast. I'm Sean Wargo, and I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Hansen. Together, we make up the market intelligence team here at Avixa,
where it's our job to identify trends in the economy and understand how they affect our industry, the professional audiovisual industry.
Hello, this is Sean Wargo and Peter Hansen of Avixa, back with our next episode of the Xceptional Insights podcast. As we're finishing the year, it's a great time for us to reflect a little bit back on 2024 and look ahead a little bit to 2025. So kind of outlooks, state of the industry, macroeconomic factors, the whole gamut that we usually talk about. So as always, we'll start with you, Peter. Give us a little sense for kind of where things are right now as we close the year and even as you kind of look ahead a bit. What should we be thinking about?
I'll start really big picture, pure economy. It's a mixed image. 2 years ago, we were really talking a lot about likely recession. That missed mostly. 2024 has been more of a year of like a little bit of strength over here, but maybe just a number of places that have like underperformed a bit. Two places to kind of call out on that account are Germany, persistent underperformance, economic difficulties there. Kind of Western, Northern Europe as a whole as well, but Germany being kind of the disappointer there. Then the other place that's certainly needs to be mentioned is China. It's still growing. Sometimes I see the word like a crisis. It's not a crisis, but it's like the challenges there are just proving deeper, more stubborn than anyone would want. And as we start to translate that into Pro AV, we've had, let's look back, the past 3 years, 2022, 23, and now 2024. 2022 was sort of like an overperformance year. We thought everyone entered the year like, this is going to be a good year. It's going to be growth, lots of recovery. And then it was really gangbusters. I mean, that was peak supply issue. Like that was a challenging year because we grew so much. And then 2023, we said, okay, it's going to grow slower. It's going to be a bit more challenged. And we saw live events overperform in 2023. Really that recovery we knew was happening. It was like even faster and sooner. But then kind of the other part kind of and the net overall was like, didn't hit probably the numbers that most folks were expecting. And 2024 seems like another one of those years where it's just like, there's a variety of factors, which we'll get into today, but it's just kind of like that overall image we're not seeing the growth that we hope for. And in fact, the series that I'll cite right now is our Pro AV Business Index, pulse of the industry, international, month by month. Like, is your business expanding, staying the same, contracting? When you look at those numbers, we're seeing expansion, and the numbers are really like the public common comparison might be like a PMI, like the manufacturing one, and like our numbers are still good compared to what you see there. But they're not good compared to what our industry is used to. The most recent number, which is the number that came out in early December for November, was actually the lowest number since January 2021. Now, like before you think like, oh, January 2021, that is a terrible time. That was a pretty rough time. But this is not a rough time. This is a very good time. And the reason it's a good time when that was a rough time is that the number said low growth. In 2021, we were in low growth in a really bad environment. And right now, and this is not be lost sight of, like disappointing growth for maybe the second year in a row relative to expectations at least, is we're at full employment. Businesses are doing well. Some underperformance here, some underperformance there. Definitely some challenges out there. So it's this slightly slower growth than we had projected and hoped for, as an industry really, but still robustly healthy, operating at full scale, full tilt, lots of really cool things happening. Now, I talked about kind of the overall, what are some of those like individual factors that contributed to this overall picture that kind of stand out to you? Like what are the lead ones that people need to know about, especially as they start to get ready for 2025?
Yeah, I would say that there's been some things we're somewhat surprised by. So as you're talking about, we knew that 24 would be a bit of a saddle. We've talked a lot about that during the 2024 business cycle and presentations that you and I have given to audiences, that we benefited from a recovery period where you would expect to see robust growth. When you see an industry down 20%, what follows in the couple years following after that is a robust growth rate as we recover. At a certain point, that levels out. And so some might call that a return to, or a new normal, a return to past normal, whatever that might look like. So for us, as we've kind of said before, that's a 5 to 6% growth rate each year. But I think there's some differences this time that have really played itself into the market. One of those is, while we benefited from accommodating or kitting industry to essentially continue working during the pandemic, a lot of those investments were made and then they're sort of played out. So now we're kind of in this a little bit of not a decline, because it's not as if people are spending less. It's just more, the investments have been made. They were experimental. We're sort of now seeing how things normalize a little bit. So that would be conference and collaboration, which we obviously could spend the rest of the time speaking about, just in terms of the continued dynamics with return to office, back to work, office utilization, that sort of stuff. But some unexpected areas where, education, we knew that would happen a little bit. There was some funding that ran out, international government level funding for schools to also kind of kit themselves. But even in the live event space, I think while we saw a lot of growth, we saw massive return of audiences. We saw record-setting concerts, live events, performances across the globe. It didn't necessarily mean that there was huge budget to then re-kit. So invest in the new technology. Part of it is because as an industry, we've continued to improve in our, I'd say, the length of time you can hold on to equipment. So its life expectancy, its usability, that sort of stuff. So an example would be like a laser-based technology, lasts longer, those sorts of things. So companies haven't had to invest as much in new equipment as they thought. So I think those are some of the undercurrents that we've seen out there. You could add then, and I would return back a little bit to maybe some macroeconomics. We've had a hedging effect. We've had election cycles. We've had geopolitics. We've had reasons for people to kind of wait and see a little bit. So having made investments, there's that wait and see. But then there's also the wait and see from a macroeconomic standpoint. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that. Are there, We've seen certainly inflation rates improve. We've seen Fed, as a result, kind of pull back on interest rates. That has been viewed as potentially a spur for further demand as we go forward. But is that real, or is there still sort of a wait and see? Cost of capital still being potentially relatively high.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that a little bit. Yeah.
Good questions. The cost of capital actually is kind of increasing, important one, and I think it's probably going to come up more in the next handful of years. Now, it definitely varies on what country you're talking about. If you're talking about China right now, like their kind of 10-year T-bills, the rates are very low. So China has not had the same inflation that a lot of the West has had. So cost of capital can be quite different depending on where you're investing. But you mentioned the Fed, and the Fed is by far the most influential rate-setting mechanism or institution in the world. They've pushed down interest rates, but the issue is that, like, when the Fed lowers their interest rates, that sort of has an effect through the market, but it's really a kind of a trickle-down type effect. Like, it's not literally, the Fed is not setting your mortgage rate. It's not setting the corporate bond market. And the way it's trickled through is it's almost like, in quotes, failed to trickle through. Like it by construction does, because that's like kind of the foundational borrowing source. But we're having an issue where there's something of a crowding out in terms of borrowing. Unfortunately, U.S. government and other governments as well, this is by far from a U.S. exclusive phenomenon, but the debt levels are getting very high. And that means that they're borrowing a lot of money, which means that when company X wants to borrow a lot of money, there's not this like pool of money sitting there that wants to go to in a bond. Like, bonds need to be greedy for money now. They need to recruit new money because it's that kind of like the money in bonds is getting soaked up so quickly and so voraciously by, frankly, government debt levels. And I think it's going to be an issue going forward because if we have some like very literal, like in the U.S., like there's President Trump's initial tax cuts are slated to expire, and the reason they're slated to expire is because it's a little bit of like a budget game. Because if they're long on the books, then they have like a really, really bad effect on like our long-term deficit. But if you say they expire, then the way that the numbers come back is like, oh, they expire, so then our revenue goes up. So they're slated to expire. But there's a lot of political pressure, and we'll see what happens, in terms of extension. And if they get extended, then we're going to have a lot more debt in the U.S. And there's a few other factors, spending, of course, and different revenue and different tax policies. So it's a complicated conversation, but it's something that really matters because, as you say, these interest rates have been a part of hesitation and maybe like slightly lower business investment in the past few years. And we've certainly long been hoping for kind of a return to low interest rate environments. Realistically, it was never going to get back to like 3% mortgage rate type paradigm. But it could realistically go lower, 4.5 might be reasonable. But that's just challenged by, frankly, the overall bond market and the levels of government debt. And it's going to be something to monitor because there's a lot more pressure on deficits in the U.S. now. Like our borrowing capacity is lower than it was in 2020. And that's true for a lot of countries. So that is a factor as well. I wanted to touch on as well, you mentioned events. That events is the subject of, actually it's our forthcoming, or maybe by the time this is out, this podcast is out, it'll also be out. But a meta report, we did a brief dive into events. And they've had quite a story, quite a ride, Huge drop, of course, in the pandemic. You mentioned 20% overall. Events is more like 50%, live entertainment, 70% for like the temporary install of live events, and then performance entertainment, more permanent install, lower percent, but huge, like bloodbath. I mean, really, really terrible. Then great recovery. And we kind of like the line you would have drawn, and a lot of was sort of like steep recovery into normal growth. But actually, if you like, I looked at a lot of like, German Bundesliga attendance, live events, like Live Nation ticket sales, like different series on these attendance. And what you found is like some areas went from like steep recovery into solid growth, and some areas went from steep recovery into like, we're not going to quite sustain that. We're going to flatten out, I think saw a bit more of than expected a kind of like overcorrection towards in-person that has now sort of like slid back just a little bit. So that's definitely been one of the challenges that was not expected, is that instead of proceeding from great growth into good growth, we proceeded from great growth into like, okay growth. And when we start to talk about like 2025 and long-term, I'll explain why I still feel really good about long-term for live events. But that's just one thing that really kind of it surprised us, the industry, this year. And we dove into that data as for this meta report and really found there's still a really good reason to be optimistic in the long term, but there's also there are just a couple of challenges, and we maybe got a little too overheated, hot under the collar, with I say we, I don't even mean just Pro AV. I mean everybody got hot under the collar to get back to those in-person events. They're like, okay, I did it. And now they're getting back to maybe normal habits, and they were, as opposed to overexcited post-pandemic habits.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you're making about events, because one of the things we notice in Pro AV, as we kind of translate that, the crowd's coming back, the audience is returning, the epic ticket sales for the Taylor Swift concert, all of that, that's a great story, and there is certainly revenue there. But I think where rubber hits the road for our industry is the reality of reinvesting in your kit, improving the tech. While we have great examples shown on some of the how they do that podcasts that we put forward, where we get behind the scenes and really pull apart the technology, clearly there's innovative stuff being done, and that does drive investment for our industry. But I think you make a good point that there's a need to kind of companies are realizing they have to kind of wait for the financial health of the organization, the events company, the touring companies to get back to a certain level to really then think about further expansion and investment at a time in which the technology itself has actually net become more affordable. You could say, I wouldn't go as far as commoditized. I would say deflationary, yes, which is the normal story of technology, right? We are part of what we do as an industry, as technologists, is bring out new and exciting innovation, better specifications, feature sets, durability, life expectancy, all the things that drive technology. But it ends up coming in at a lower and lower price over time as we work out the efficiencies of it. Some of that is supply chain improvements. We learn a lot from things like pandemics that disrupt supply chain, and therefore we have to adjust and adapt and build in some more efficiencies. You could also say that the rampant growth that we've had also encourages additional investment in capacity, which then can flood the market in other situations to where we have too much supply. So an example is the display category, where we have more product available in the market and therefore a price point that's come down. Therefore, potentially encouraging more volume investment, digital signage proliferation, usage as backdrops or green screen effect and virtual production capability within an event. But all of that, it comes at a lower price point over time. So we have to factor that in too. And I think that's been a reality of this saddle that we're in. We saw rampant growth. We saw companies respond to that growth with some further investment, some further availability of product. And as the demand kind of normalizes, settles out, you have more product available than you needed. And so factoring in a deflation into our overall growth expectation, I think, is where we're at. But talk a little bit more about pricing. I think you're kind of seeing the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, one thing we highlighted probably a lot this time last year was that we were exiting the difficult supply era. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I credit to our industry. Our industry was not some industry that price gouged, charged the highest dollar you could get. They mostly kept prices relatively reasonable, even if they were back ordered for many months. And, but that was a very specific buying environment then. End users were making purchases basically what can I get in a timely fashion? And we were really highlighting and have been highlighting it, but especially maybe a year ago or so, it's about the old stuff, tech specs, what exactly, precisely do my end users need, and price. And so companies weren't gouging, but they weren't feeling price pressure. In this environment where demand far outstrips supply, if you had supply, you could charge to a first approximation what you wanted. You had them over the barrel a little bit. So you didn't have to worry about getting every 1 or 2%. And it's not every section, but yeah, like you mentioned, displays, another, when display prices go down, projection is kind of squeezed. As well, that's an area in particular we've seen some price point challenges, making revenue challenges. Yeah, you just have literal price deflation, and that's on top of sort of the technology advance that also can create some kind of that is literally deflationary. If you pay the same price but get a better product, that's also deflationary. So that's been a real challenge to achieving revenue goals. Is frankly, end users are paying less to get the same amount of product in 2024, and it's depending on the project, depending on which category, and that has challenged our industry to hit certain revenue targets.
Absolutely, yeah. I think as we turn ahead to 2025, it then becomes the question of where does the growth come from? So I think we'll probably finish out with our expectations for outlook for 2025. As we look back, events is kind of the spot where we were talking because of experience economy, because of return of audience, because of all of those driving factors. We thought the value and the growth comes from events, essentially, whether it's performance entertainment, live events, as solution areas, venues, hospitality, some transportation, yes, because of travel, all those areas. But as we look forward, I think the surprise has been, as we're kind of reflecting on now, that there is, because of cycles of innovation, because of price point deflation, because of desire to see kind of financial health return, I would say that growth story, while still existing, is a bit more challenged. So question is, does 2025 look better than 2024 in terms of a growth rate? There's a lot of reasons to say yes. And I would say certainly there's plenty of wind in the sails of the experience economy. The consumer is showing incredible resilience and interest in continuing to spend outside the home. And that lends to further potential for investment. You would say, yes, there's a volume story to things like conference and collaboration and corporate. I still think there's a lot of wind in the sails, too, of digital signage as we see more display prices coming down. So growth rates that we were originally thinking would be, say, a few tenths of points, I guess, above 2024. I think that story still holds. I still think that it looks pretty good for a 25 growth rate to be higher than a 24. But I also acknowledge the reality is it's a bit more challenged than we would have said before. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a few points above 2024, but that's a lower 2024 than we were maybe initially thinking.
Absolutely,
so it's like
yes.
We're still
net down. Yeah,
down on what we would have said last year or this time last year about 2025. Even if we think 2025 has some advantages over 2024. Yeah. I think that holds a lot of water, and one of the places I teased earlier, like kind of like the positivity in my research, and kind of the deep dive that we did on events, and that comes from sort of like more that overall data, kind of pre-pandemic versus current, both like pro AV revenue and pro AV spend, like kind of like end user spending compared to overall attendance and overall activity. Like you can kind of pull apart, for example, US GDP data and look at some relevant experience economy categories and kind of see how they've fared, inflation adjusted since the pandemic. And what you see there is that Pro AV is getting like fundamentally like a lower percent of the overall economic activity in like live events, live entertainment than it did pre-pandemic. And I feel very strongly that that's mostly a short-term phenomenon. Like that's like, okay, let's get financial good health. Let's make sure we're like these people are really back here. And also like, let's make sure we really know how we want to spend this, because like we've been innovating about like remote stuff for a couple of years. Like let's innovate about the new era, the post-pandemic era. What's awesome AV there, like we've seen new big innovations. Like what's the distributed version of that? Like what's the local small city event venue version of like the coolest part of the sphere? Or like, the like small band touring version of like what's cool about the Taylor Swift concert. And I think those are the innovations that you're going to see. And I that economic activity that's there in experience economy gives me a lot of confidence that there's just untapped potential, or like soon to be tapped potential for our industry as it kind of gets its feet under itself again, and the innovators really focus on where we are now and kind of like move beyond the challenges and like, the answers that they provided, quite frankly, during some tough years that were just very different from now. And now we're in some new tough years, and they're providing new answers. So that gives me a lot of confidence, not even just 2025, but long term. I do think 2025 does have a couple challenges maybe that 2024 has or even doesn't have. those price pressures, I don't see them kind of really relenting. We're in that new environment where, it's like kind of a back to the old environment where price matters a lot, and there's going to be a lot of price competition. It's not going to be, I think, more intense than 2024, because if you look at our data on how much supply has been a problem, like it really has been background for a long time. Like people have been able to get what they want, so the competition has been on price along with the other normal factors. So I see that continuing in 2025 and see that continuing to be a challenge. Another one that I think we have to mention is tariffs, quite frankly. That was a big campaign topic of incoming President Trump. And, that's U.S. specific, but that's tariffs on products coming to the U.S. And then you can bet on retaliatory tariffs or quotas on products going from the U.S. to other countries. So it's definitely going to be something that's felt internationally, especially when you think about like somewhat complicated supply lines that maybe cross in and out on their way to, even a country that's, you're thinking like, oh, it's not crossing that border, but maybe some components are, and that's something to keep in mind. That could be a little bit inflationary. It could just be a little bit of, just sanding the gears in terms of getting what you want, like maybe someone doesn't supply to the same number of countries because of some barriers or quotas that happen. That's a challenge that we're going to potentially face in 2025. It's an uncertainty right now. I know it's something that we just collect a little data about it, haven't published anything, but that companies are thinking about. They're not really making big steps yet because we don't know. But something to keep in mind is something that's going to be a challenge that 2025 is facing that 2024 didn't. But we'll see. How do you see that, and how do you see sort of 2025 beyond, just to kind of like take us all the way forward?
Yeah, and I think I would turn it into a question for us both to reflect on as we're on the doorstep of ISE coming up, particularly at the time that this is finally reaching publication. We'll be likely headed out the door to ISE. So thinking about 25, and also therefore what I am most looking forward to seeing at ISE as kind of the opportunity areas of interest, of keen interest. We've talked a lot about events, but the component of that I think has some weight to it and some still unrealized opportunity is in the category of broadcast AV. So they're going to be doing a summit on that at ISE with some good content, good speakers, just kind of how the democratization of this kind of content, the video content, is happening and creating opportunity for Pro AV that's kind of pivoting. Both broadcast companies pivoting into this area and traditional AV companies pivoting over. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out. So the contextual stuff, tariffs, inflation rates, interest rates, all things that give you pause and maybe give you a dose of reality, realism to an expectation, an outlook. It's these kinds of technology areas like broadcast AV and even events continuing. And as you noted, great thought on the kind of how eventually the funding gets released in order to have the technology component catch up in terms of the proportionality of investment. So what's your pick? So as you think about ISE and 2025 in general, kind of what's your pick?
Well, it's not a tech podcast if you don't mention AI at some point.
True.
And like, folks, I promise I never use AI as a source, but I really do love using AI in sort of my day-to-day job. Is something that's clearly increased. It's things like I use it for like summarizing or like sort of like basic, getting my head around maybe a new concept. I also use it to help me find some like good sources, like get the ball rolling. And because I love it, I'm just so curious to see, like we talked about AI before ISE last year, and I was thinking like, we're going to see it a bunch at ISE, and I was like, it was there, but not crazy,
Definitely.
And a big part of that is that, our industry is so tech forward, but it's also like very feet on the ground. Like you need to like go into a booth and see something that you can install tomorrow. It's not like CES in Vegas that's like, yeah, this will be available for sale in like, I don't know, 3 years maybe. Like, why don't you contribute to our GoFundMe or whatever, Kickstarter? And so AI wasn't too prominent there, and I'm going to be curious to like put the finger on the pulse again and kind of see where it is. Is it more? Maybe it's a little less of a buzzword now, so it'll even be less. But maybe it'll be quietly into a product or two more, especially as we, have things moving towards remote monitoring and managed services like AI tech support. That's for me my little area of focus.
Sounds good. I agree. You've heard it here first. Certainly AI and broadcast AV, the areas of interest for us as we go to ISE. Our next broadcast will be actually from ISE. So we'll look to speak to each other then and get some additional perspective and thoughts of what's been hot or cool at the show. Otherwise, this has been Peter and Sean, Xceptional Insights. We'll see you next time. Be well, be safe, and see you in the new year.